Now, Champollion is given the credit for deciphering the Rosetta Stone, but there's a lot of people who worked on it before he came along and basically, finished the thing off. The Rosetta Stone is basically talking about Ptolemy the Fourth is talking about Ptolemy the Fifth and how he should be celebrated for his work and stuff like that. This is what the stone is talking about. Now, the whole issue is, of course, as I said, is trying to figure out, was the Greek talking about the same thing as the Demotic and the ancient Egyptian? And once they figured out it's talking about the same thing, now the whole problem was deciphering it, like figuring out how to match up the words, the corresponding words from Greek, which they already knew, the ancient Greek, the Demotic, which they was having trouble with, and of course, the ancient Egyptian, which they claim they had no clue how to decipher it. So Champollion basically deciphered the name Ptolemy from the Demotic text, and he did so using the Egyptian cartouche. And he determined that the phonetic properties of the Demotic text corresponds with the Egyptian hieroglyphics. So Demotic text is basically like the common language in Kemet. It was like a common language, according to Herodotus, who basically gave it that name. So you have Demotic, and before Demotic, you had the hieratic hieroglyphics. And a hieratic is basically like the priestly text of priestly writings. It was what they used when they had to write a whole lot. So basically, if you had to write a 2-page letter, if you use hieroglyphics only, then it would take a long time, because hieroglyphics is basically really detailed. You got to draw stuff out. So hieratic was basically developed alongside of hieroglyphics, in case you had to write stuff like really, really long and put in document form. So this is what the priests used. They used a reed brush when they wrote in hieratic. It's that writing tool you see Thoth always had, a little pen he has when he writes. So you have the Demotic, you have the hieratic, and then you have cursive hieroglyphics. And cursive hieroglyphics is basically like what they used when they had to write like books or religious documents. And it's when you had to do like a huge, large work, but it had to basically be in hieroglyphic form almost. So it's like a dumbed down version of hieroglyphics. When you look at it, you can see it's not as detailed as hieroglyphics. But they used it, when they had to write books and things like that. It had to be in the Papyrus of Anu is written in cursive hieroglyphics, so to speak. So, you have the Demotic, you have the hieratic, you have cursive hieroglyphics. And then you get to regular hieroglyphics, and then you can go further than that, actually. You got regular hieroglyphics, you can get into the New Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and Old Kingdom hieroglyphics, because they did things a little bit, different each time. So when you start getting into the writings of the ancient Egyptians, you start getting into the language and everything like that, it goes back. It's a lot that you have to deal with, that you can't just, look at a Rosetta Stone and decipher. We're talking about thousands of years of writing and language. So Champollion looked at the Rosetta Stone. He could see the ancient Egyptian, you could see the ancient Greek, and you have the Demotic, which they knew was a Egyptian language that they actually spoke in Egypt. But we also know that Coptic came from Demotic, and Coptic was the last language that they spoke in Kemet, before the Arabs came and basically took Kemet away from the Romans. Coptic was the language that they used, and Coptic basically has borrowed words from Greek. It is also similar in its alphabet to the Greek alphabet. So, again, the thing is, we always talk about how they stole our language. Then, this goes back all the way to ancient Kemet, where we know for sure that Coptic is basically like a Christian language. Basically, it's made for Christianity, and they created it and forced it on the Egyptians to basically get rid of the Demotic language and to really instill Christianity in them. And we're going to see that a lot as we go through in this video, how Coptic was basically the language that came along and to try to basically hide Egyptian. Now, remember I said you have English was made for Christianity, Coptic as well, Arabic for the Quran, and Hebrew for Judaism, or what have you. These languages is created to cover up the true origins of the people and the religion itself, when you really get into it. It's there to cover it up. So understand, no matter what Champollion came up with, the problem is we are not going to know how the ancient Egyptian language actually sounds. How it sounds coming from them. So we can only speculate. We can only wonder, is it close? So no matter how much they worked on Rosetta Stone, no matter how much we talk about it now, we're not going to know 100% for sure. Is what we are pronouncing and believing is the Egyptian language, actually the language, that it actually sound this way? Are we pronouncing words correctly? And this is one of the dilemmas that we find and that Champollion found when he was going through this whole decipherment. Champollion deciphered the name Ptolemy first. So he found two symbols in the name Ptolemy that matched the name of Thutmose and Ramses. So now we know that, again, we're not going to know exactly how the Egyptian names sound. We're not going to know that. But we do know that the Coptic comes from Demotic. So Coptic, they understand. So if he can basically find the word in Coptic that corresponds or fits with ancient Greek, which they also understand, and that's on the Rosetta Stone, then that will help them to decipher the rest of the Rosetta Stone. Now, again, understand they already believe that it all says the same thing anyway. It's just written in different languages. But there's an opportunity now, since you have all this stuff in different languages, to basically break down exactly what the Egyptian hieroglyphics is saying. So if they can find in Coptic something that matches in ancient Greek, and then they will get the decipherment for the demonic and basically get the decipherment for the ancient Egyptian using these two symbols that he found in the name of Ptolemy, Thutmose, and Ramses. So let me explain a little bit more. Okay, so let me explain. These are basically the two symbols that Champollion seen, that he saw in the Ptolemy cartouche, and he saw in the name for Thutmose and Ramses as well. So it looks something like, and forgive my hieroglyphic style. What you have. So, two symbols right here that he got the letters MS or the MIS sound or the Ms sound for Coptic. So you have this symbol, which is the two symbols, but you can also have, let me see, and if you can see that. And he got the MS sound from these glyphs. So we know in Coptic, he looked and seen that MS basically translate in Coptic as to give birth. This is why we put MS in front of the woman's name or MIS in front of the woman's name. And you get MS or MIS or MIS in Coptic. So we have MS or MIS means to give birth. And we have the word in English demise, which basically means, death. So he saw this in the Thutmose and Ramses, the demise or the mess or that sound. And he basically figured out that it's in Coptic. And he looked at it in ancient Greek, and he saw a group of words referring to birthday. So that gave him a connection that he had birthday, and he had a word, basically Egyptian word meaning to give birth. And he made a connection from the Coptic to the Demotic to the ancient Greek, and it helped him basically decipher the stone. Now, obviously, this wasn't the same for all of the hieroglyphics, but it helped him to decipher what Coptic couldn't. So now you also got to remember that a lot of people wrote about ancient Egypt. This is one of the reasons why we know, of course, a lot of the things to be true. Why I always rag on the Hebrews, because, so many people wrote about ancient Kemet. And you have, the same with almost every single civilization. People wrote about these civilizations because they went there, they explored, and when you go to a different civilization, you already know if you travel, when you go to like Aruba or Mexico, you know that this is totally different from where you come from. And it's something to talk about, and, we post pictures today. So back then, of course, they wrote about and they talked about the different civilizations that they visited. So Kemet, of course, was written about a lot, and they already knew about some of the names of the pharaohs. They already knew about some of the customs and things like that. People like Herodotus, of course, they had access to those writings, Champollion and them, when they was doing this decipherment. So they had access to some stelas and some writings, and people already had like this basic understanding of some of the, let's just say, the myths or what have you of ancient Kemet. So it helped him in his decipherment. Now, some of the stuff he used some of the stelas and some of the stuff that people provided, but a lot of things he just basically took back to Coptic, since Coptic was working. So let me basically explain what he's seen, and you basically have, let's see, forget my cartouche drawing, but you'll have this and so Champollion seen, okay, he looked at he said, you know what, this looks like a sun. And he said, in Coptic, we know the sun is Ra or Re. So you have Ra, and he said, you know what, this thing looks like an M. And you have Ra, M-E-S-E-S, which is Ramses. So Ra, Ramses, where they got, or Rametsu, that's where they got it. And the thing is, when you see this, what you'll find out later is a lot of it is like abbreviation for the Greeks or the Romans. So sometimes when they did hieroglyphics, they didn't want to write the entire name, because we know Ramses' real name is like way longer than that. You need like 2 cartouches to get his name. So this is what they did. So another thing, you have, or let me see. Okay, so another thing that Champollion seen, he remembered, as I said, they had writings from Herodotus and Diodorus or what have you to help them out in their decipherment. So you have the ibis right here. He's seen the ibis, and he said, you know what, I remember Herodotus said that Thoth basically gave them the writing system, and he was represented by an ibis. So when you seen the ibis, he had Thoth. And then you had Moses, M-S, M-E-S, or M-O-S. So when he seen this glyph, he put together Thoth, Moses. And that's how you got the Thutmose name. Again, the whole thing is, you could say it's not the same translation, or it's incorrect, but when you put it together, it actually fits with who they are talking about, which is Thutmose. So it's a lot of different ways. When he went back and just simply used the Coptic, it was fitting with a lot of the things he was trying to decipher. So with a lot of the cartouches and with a lot of the hieroglyphics, he just simply took it back to Coptic, or took it back to things that made sense. And this is like really clear, easy. You got Thoth, Moses. And when you look at the hieroglyph for Thoth, sometimes you see it going sideways and it looks basically just like that. So it's just some of the things that he used. Now, and again, obviously you can't do this with every single symbol, but it will help you to isolate some of the sounds, but it won't help you to basically decipher an entire wall of hieroglyphics. So that basically gives you like a little insight into what Champollion is talking about, and that it can't all possibly be true. You can't decipher all of those Egyptian texts using these methods, or just simply going back to Coptic. There has to be another way that you use, another thing that you use to help you decipher all of these Egyptian hieroglyphics. I mean, even going back to the hieratic and cursive hieroglyphics into the New Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, Old Kingdom, where they use different styles. And then you have to still differentiate from when the Romans was writing hieroglyphics and when the Greeks was writing hieroglyphics, in which case we see that if they didn't want to put Ramses' whole name up there, you see how they did it with the sun and, the way I showed you. And these cases, a lot of times, what we call like abbreviations, a lot of the times the abbreviations was done by the Greeks and the Romans. And it just took people a long time to figure out that this was the Romans and Greeks writing in hieroglyphics and that they just abbreviated. So, with Champollion, you can't really go by everything he's talking about. What he really did was basically, kick in the door and leave it open for a lot of people to come in and correct some of his mistakes and basically help to really decipher the hieroglyphics. The problem is a lot of these people who came along later and was doing work, they are not recognized, they are not talked about. And then you have a lot of people like myself and many other scholars who basically did their own research because, listen, man, I'm going to tell you, if you get into this stuff, if you're really into it, and you're really into hieroglyphics and deciphering it and looking into the language, when you look at the excuse they give us from Champollion, it don't fit. It's just that simple. It's like, the stuff makes sense. The hieroglyphics, you see, well, wait a minute, what y'all saying fits. I mean, we can basically read this stuff, but the way they're telling us how they did it don't work. It don't fit. So they're leaving something out, and this is causing a huge problem for people who are now starting to come into this knowledge and starting to do the research. And it will lead you to believe or not believe in Champollion, but it will lead you to basically question the whole process of reading, writing, and understanding hieroglyphics. So now here's the thing that we are forgetting about. A lot of people forget that. Remember, we know that the Greeks lived in Kemet. We know that they worked with the Egyptians. We know that they lived with the Egyptians. And we have to remember that, one, the Egyptians did not adopt any outside customs. And Herodotus attests to that fact, that the Egyptians wouldn't learn any other languages or anything like that. So we can assume that the Greeks also knew Demotic, and this is how they communicated with the Egyptians. They had to communicate some way, somehow, unless there was another language spoken that we don't know about, or Demotic is just a lower form spoken only by just the commoners in Kemet. That could be possible as well, but we have to assume that the Greeks had to know this language, and this was the way they was communicating. Now, again, Herodotus is the one who gave it the name Demotic. The Egyptians actually called the language Chit-Chat, which basically means writing for documents. So again, we're not going to know exactly how the language sounded, but it doesn't mean that the Egyptian hieroglyphics or the Mentu Neter was not deciphered. The simple fact that the Egyptians had a name for it gives us a clue that, this is either a lower form of writing or a lower form of communication developed probably just to communicate, to do business or what have you, and there was another language that was spoken. But again, it doesn't mean that the hieroglyphics wasn't figured out or that they didn't correspond, the Demotic, to fit with the actual hieroglyphics in order for it to be translated or deciphered. And this is something we're going to get into as we go along. So now, as I said in the beginning, I can understand why people are skeptical about the translation of the Mentu Neter. As I said, when I first started studying this stuff, when I got into it, when I looked into the explanation for the decipherment of the Rosetta Stone and the Egyptian hieroglyphics, and I read about the whole story with Champollion, what I'm giving you right now, I said to myself, you know what, this is some bullshit. It's bullshit. Because it just didn't fit, it didn't seem right, especially when you start getting into the Coptic part. Because Coptic would not decipher the entire Egyptian hieroglyphics as I'm explaining here. And they're not really going to give you too much more information into what else Champollion used. So of course, it's really suspect. It's skeptical, and we know that these people lie. This is what they are doing. This is why a lot of people in the Kemetic community don't want to really deal with European writings and stuff like that, because we know they lie, and they damn sure not going to tell us the truth about something, especially if that truth is going to reveal African people to look smarter than what they have portrayed us. And this is basically the case in this whole thing with Champollion, as we're going to get into. But when you look at history, you still have to say to yourself, when you look at the history between the Greeks and the Egyptians, you have to say to yourself, of course, the Medu Neter was deciphered. Of course, the Greeks can read it, because, they would not have turned on the Egyptians. They wouldn't have set them up and turned on them if they couldn't read the glyphs. It don't make no sense. We know, again, Thales, we know Pythagoras, Plato, we know they studied in Kemet. I mean, look at all of the things that the Greeks and Romans was able to build, after conquest of Kemet. I mean, all of the structures, we know before Kemet fell, they didn't have none of these cities and everything like that. They didn't have the kind of architecture that they are known for when Egypt was in its heyday. We didn't see this kind of stuff until conquest. So, of course, Thales, Herodotus, Pythagoras, all these people who talk about, Greek and talk about Kemet, we know they went there, they studied. The knowledge in mathematics that they have is unbelievable. And they give openly the credit to Kemet and going there to study. So they would not have left, as I said before, all that gold, all them jewels, just the priceless artifacts that, they found later on in Kemet. They wouldn't have left all that stuff there if they didn't leave with something far more valuable that would basically have them set, forever. And, they left with the knowledge and information that they used to build the empire that we still see in power today. So they had to, of course, decipher all this stuff and understand Rosetta Stone. I mean, understand the language and everything like that. They had to. So we know what happened. After they got the information, after they basically didn't need Kemet no more, they decreed that, the temples was devil worship and it was demon worship. Anybody who go in there and start studying any of the Kemetic writings or what have you, it was considered to be demonic text or the demonic text or devil worship. And, the Pope closed the temples down, and basically they left Kemet to be buried, in the sand. So now understand, when they did find the Rosetta Stone, of course, the powers that be knew what it was. They knew how to translate it. They know how to read the demonic. They knew how to read the hieroglyphics. Now, if Champollion really wanted to decipher the Egyptian hieroglyphics, where should he have gone? He should have went straight to Nubia, to the Sudan. We know there they got the Meroitic script. And the Meroitic script was basically created from the Egyptian hieroglyphics. It was created between 750 and 300 BCE. Now, it's basically, this is during the Napatan period. And Napatan is basically when Napatan was one of the capitals of Kush. So the Napatan is talked about by a lot of Greek scholars. Diodorus talks about it. Herodotus talks about it. So they knew all about it. So when it was basically using the writings from Herodotus, because when you start getting into what Champollion used to do this decipherment, as I said before, they went to some of the writings of Herodotus and Diodorus and a lot of the Greek scholars and, Plato and stuff like that to really try to get an understanding of the Egyptian text and what have you. So he should have went to Nubia, because even then they knew about the Meroitic script. They knew all about it. And when you look here, we can see that they got the Meroitic demotic script. They have the Meroitic hieroglyphics. This is not something that is new on the scene. They understood that a lot of the people fled from Kemet down into lower Africa, where all the war was going on. So they knew about these scripts, and they knew it was a possibility that either the entire Egyptian language survived somewhere else, or it at least evolved into different languages. Now, again, as I said, the powers that be can already decipher the hieroglyphics. They already knew how to read Medu Neter. Anybody who came along after that used African languages to decipher the Medu Neter. And this is what Champollion used. If Champollion wasn't an agent that was put in place to do this whole, press tidbit about the Rosetta Stone to just basically make them look smarter than what they are, then he used African text to decipher the Medu Neter, the Rosetta Stone, or what have you, because there's no way he could have just got the whole translation of all of the symbols and the Egyptian hieroglyphics using simply Coptic, which they try to lead you to believe. The problem is, of course, they don't want to give Kemet or give the African languages credit. Now, as I said, of course, the powers that be could read the Egyptian hieroglyphics. Anybody that tried to do a translation of the Egyptian hieroglyphics had to use African text, African writing to do the translation. There's no way Champollion could have got this whole entire translation done by simply using Coptic. And that's the issue. They don't want to give the credit to the African languages, because what you will find out is every single language that was used or derived from Egyptian hieroglyphics or a hieroglyphic style of writing was eventually replaced by Coptic. And this is why you see with the same thing with the Meroitic script, it was replaced by Coptic. And this is why what we see with Demotic, you have Coptic, and why you can use Coptic to basically go back and decipher Demotic, because they took a little piece of every language that they changed and kind of sort of put it into that group or that civilization style of Coptic. So you'll have a bunch of different civilizations that have Coptic, but depending on the language that it derived from or they took it from, some of the phonetic or phonemes or some of the little things about the dialect will be changed to fit that specific civilization. And this is what we find. So it's a lot of civilizations in Africa that basically had hieroglyphic styles of writing. So we look at we have Liberia, Cameroon, Nigeria, so many other places, Somalia as well, that basically had a hieroglyphic style of writing, and we see that most of these was basically changed or taken over and replaced with Coptic. So now you got to ask yourself a question, basically, what happened to the ancient Egyptians? And everybody always say that, well, what happened to them? Where did they go? A lot of them did end up staying in Kemet, and we don't know how many. If you go to Kemet, you're going to see African people there. You don't know if they are natives of Kemet, that they evolved there and stay there, which I doubt. But a lot of the people fled into Lower Africa. We know they went into Nigeria. They went to the Gala people who they had strong relationship with, or the Igala people. We know they went into Benin. They went into the Sudan. They went to a lot of different places in Lower Africa where we still find remnants and artifacts of the ancient Egyptians. And they took the language with them, and the language evolved. Now, Champollion, or whoever did the decipherment of the Medu Neter that we have, that we look to today and read, whoever it is had to use African language to do the decipherment, period. There's no way around that. Or Champollion had to use it as well, or, he is a fraud and probably was basically put there as a puppet to basically, kind of stir people away from the true decipherment or the real explanation of how they figured out the Rosetta Stone or figured out the decipherment of the Medu Neter. So he had to either be in on a whole big scam or use the African language and didn't want to basically report on it and tell where it came from to make itself look, smarter. There's no way in the world, as I said, that they deciphered it all using Coptic. It's just not possible, when you understand how this stuff works, that Coptic would basically account for the decipherment of the entire language. And this is what it seems like they're trying to project on people, that, the Christian Coptic came and basically, reveal the text to the people. So when you start getting into it, we know they had to get certain dialects and tones and stuff from Africa, from these tribes, because we still find it to this day. When you start pronouncing some of the Egyptian words and how it sounds, if you go and then find it in an African civilization, what does that tell you? Now, to me, when I'm researching this stuff and when I hear people talking about the hieroglyphics, like I said, I can understand how people are skeptical about Metu Neter and, everything that involves the language as far as it pertains to Europeans. I understand how people are skeptical about it, how they can't really go along with what they are reading, because there are not a lot of books out there that a lot of people know about that's really getting into Metu Neter and the history of it. Because when something makes sense and it fits, you basically leave it alone. But it never dawned on a lot of people to basically question the decipherment of it, because it fits, it works, and this is something that I'm probably going to end up writing a book on, probably my third or fourth book. I'll probably get into this because there's so much more information than what's in here that will basically help a lot of people out down the line. Maybe books out that I don't know about that really go into what I'm going into here. But from our research, as I said, when you really get into something and you research stuff, you know what people are talking about. You know where they could have ran into a problem or an issue involving a subject because you came across the same thing in your research, which is why, as I always say, you don't stop at one source. You go to different sources and you try to figure out if the last source was true, or try to validate what the last source was talking about. So now we go to people like Sheikh Anta Diop, Ivan van Sertima, and you listen to a lot of these scholars when they talked about dealing with the Metu Neter and dealing with the Egyptian hieroglyphics and what have you. They talked about going into Nigeria, going into Benin and other countries in Africa to basically see how much of the actual tones, the language, had survived. And that's something that struck me a long time ago, and I was like, why would you go into Nigeria? Because they knew that, of course, the Egyptians fled south. They got out of Egypt and they fled to many different places, and they took the language with them, and it survived and developed into different languages. So when you research that, you run into a lot of different things I'm going to get into probably in the next part. We'll get into a lot more when we get into actual writing and stuff like that. I had to get through this because there's no way you can move forward without you understanding this right here, as you can understand. But this is what we find. Take a look. It says traditions and linguistic evidences. Yoruba, Itakari, Igala or Gala are Egyptians, a proof of pure science. I'm going to read that again. Traditions and linguistic evidences. Yoruba, Itakari, Igala or Gala are Egyptians. That is amazing right there. And you're going to see this a lot more when you start digging into the subject, because there's a lot of people who've been trying to point out for years that, well, wait a minute, we have found the ancient Egyptians. We found the people. We found where they went. We found where they settled there, where they fled to. And you're not going to see a lot of traction for that. This is something they want to cover up. It's something they don't want people to understand and know, because, of course, who the Egyptians was and the claim that they have to Kemet and the claim that they have to all this information that these Europeans and the powers that be have been using basically to control everything. If these people came out and can basically reclaim their birthright and reclaim Kemet and have the knowledge to back it up, which when you start getting to some of the evidence, they almost can, but they, of course, want to suppress that. So when you get into this thing, I highlighted this part right here because I want you to read and see, some of the people who they mentioned as being the top dogs in this field of research. And you can see here, it's giving you some names, but right here it says Diop. And Sheikh Anta Diop is one of the people who really got into this stuff. And he is one of the best people in the study of Egypto-African linguistic relationships. Most African languages have a very short writing record. Despite this anomaly, they have a long oral history base in spite of their short written record. And, of course, remember, when we go back to ancient Kemet, we see that for a long time, it's no writing. Remember the Great Pyramid and stuff like that? There's no writing inside those pyramids. We get into the temples and the schools and everything like that. We start to find the writings in the Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom, and so on and so forth. So we know for a long time that, there was no writing. and everything was done orally, and there was no need to write. And you got to understand, like, I mean, when you really get into what you need to write something for, I mean, we write stuff to memorize it. You know, basically, I mean, if your memory is fresh, it's cool, you're not putting nothing in your body, you're going to remember everything that you learned, no need to write it down. You know, writing is sort of a form of, it's a primitive form. You shouldn't need to write. But we know why the Egyptians did it, because they understood the fall in consciousness, and they wanted to put this stuff in stone. They put this stuff out there, so in case they fell again, or in case something happened with the civilization. But when you take a look at this research that they're doing here, we can see here it says, in comparing the genetic relationship of two distinct languages, the whole phylum, which phylum means a group of languages that's related to each other, rather than a single dialect, is considered. Despite the fact that our research was not able to reach all the Kemetic words, we are still able to get 123 words out of the 205 external syntactic symbols to be cognate between the Egyptians and Yoruboids, 59.6%, which is basically 60%. The meaning of it is that the present Yoruboid language is 60% the same as the ancient Egyptian language spoken 10,000 years BC. So they're basically saying it's the same language, and you know, based on 123 words that they got in 205, which is 60%, they say it's basically the same. Beyond the Swadesh list, there are other scientific linguistic approaches to show the relatedness between the Itsekari or Yoruboid language with the ancient Egyptian. Charles Jor, a Hebrew scholar, has shown that when 3 out of the 5 sense organs of the peoples are similar or identical, there must be a point of contact in history between them. So you go down here, you start reading these, he's basically comparing the sounds from Egyptian and Itsekari and Yoruboid with the, they comparing the languages together. I'm not going to read them all because it's like crazy to pronounce. But basically he said, thus it's seen that all the 5 senses in Egypt and Itsekari are cognates. This goes even beyond Swadesh and deep into modern science. So basically, and this was a long report. I'm going to probably get into it in my book. I'm definitely going to do a book on this because it needs to be done from what I can see. Definitely going to get into this. So it's basically saying from this long report, when you go through it, I mean, they go matching the words up, all the words that he mentioned, and they get into the symbols and everything like that. And you basically can see from what they're telling us is that the dialects of these African tribes, these African civilizations, match up precisely with the Egyptian language, and that not just that possibly they sound alike. So we can possibly, that's what I'm saying, we're not going to know what the Egyptians actually sound like, but possibly from looking at these Africans and the way they pronounce these words, it's a strong possibility that it sounds exactly the same as the ancient Egyptians. I don't know how many scholars have told you guys, basically, when they was deciphering or going through their teachings about the Egyptian hieroglyphics, those who learned from Africans basically really was explaining that the dialects can still be found today in Africa and a lot of African civilizations, that the tones and the sounds that it makes comes from Kemet and still can be found today in Africa. So again, this means, as I said, you know, when you understand how it works, there's no way that they did the actual translation of the Rosetta Stone or gave us all of these translations of the Mental Nature without going to Africa. And it's causing a lot of confusion because they are not explaining completely how they got this translation. They are using Champollion and just basically, as I said, trying to make it like, oh, Champollion deciphered it, and, you know, he's smart and all this and that, and, you know, just basically a white supremacist move to show that they figured out the Egyptian hieroglyphics, when that's bogus, when we know that the dialects and the language basically still exist in different forms in many civilizations in Africa. So it's causing the confusion because people don't know that and because they ain't put that out.